Hey everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick comparison between the Samsung NX500 on the left and the Sony A6000 on the right. Both of these are mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras, both in my opinion great options if you're in the market for a compact interchangeable lens camera. Of course, both have different strong suits, benefits respectively. I'll start off with the NX500, which is the newer product of the two options here on the table, and it really does combine all of the best tech that Samsung has to offer in the form of a mirrorless interchangeable lens camera. You've got 4K video capturing, capped at 15 minutes, unlike the NX1, which goes up to the roughly 30-minute video capture, but that's something you will not find with the A6000. Keep in mind the A6000 can be found for less money. It is an older product, but it doesn't have much of the technology that the NX500 has to offer. But even despite that, when it comes to being a digital camera first, a mirrorless digital SLR replacement, in my opinion, the A6000 is the better option if that's purely what you are after. The sensors are very close in terms of megapixel count. We've got aps-c in both of them, but the A6000 a little bit less, 24.3 as opposed to the 28 found in the NX500. Both come with kit zoom, power zoom lenses. I don't have the power zoom lens here. You've noticed I have the 20mm prime f2.8 lens, and it does give you a very good idea though of what the form would be like with the power zoom, because it is a very similar size lens when you've got the hood on. So just for demonstration purposes, I wanted to be able to show you exactly what each body would look like side by side. In terms of controls, I'm definitely partial to what Sony has done. It's a more mature design. It comes from years of making E-mount bodies and really trying to improve them and listening to consumers, whereas I feel like Samsung is more in the experimental phase. They have been around for several years now in this business, and the 28 megapixel BSI sensor, again, also aps-c that's in here, many could argue is actually superior to the aps-c sensor that Sony has on board. Also, the hybrid autofocus, they might argue, is faster, even though the 11 frames per second in the A6000 is simply amazing. But the ratio of keepers, well, that becomes a case-by-case basis for different consumers that would definitely argue one way or the other. And I'm not going to get into that argument. Both are stellar when it comes to autofocus. Beyond 4K video here, which you do not have in the A6000, you do have high-quality 1080p video in XAVC-S format. You don't have the H.265, the latest and greatest codec, the most efficient codec for video on Earth, but that's also a problem for the NX500 because that means that you're going to have to convert every single piece of video that you shoot if you actually plan to watch it, share it, edit it, whatever it may be. So as efficient as it is, it ends up being a mess in post or even just playback. Something that I think the average consumer is going to love about the A6000 is that most aren't even or haven't adopted 4K yet, let alone they aren't at the point where they're ready to have to do more work than just capture their moments and be able to share them. Both have NFC, both have Wi-Fi, so nothing really different there, but Sony has made sure to continue to develop their Play Memories application store, so there is a very wide variety of different applications you can download, both in terms of time-lapse, creativity applications that just do not exist for Samsung's NX500. But when it comes to tech, again, Samsung does beat out the Sony in almost every department. You've got a Super AMOLED display. Samsung makes Super AMOLEDs for a living. It makes sense they're incorporated into a camera. This is kind of something I've wanted to see forever, and Sammy's doing it for good reason. It should be done across the board by everyone, but it is a more expensive process unless you're the world's largest or one of the world's largest manufacturers of OLED displays. In terms of the power zoom and its stabilization, it does a fairly good job. I mentioned very quick to autofocus, as well as a very intuitive touchscreen here that you're not getting with the Sony offering. The A6000 simply does not have a touchscreen display, but what it does have in its favor is a great OLED EVF. So despite the compact form factor, you still have much of the comfort of a traditional digital SLR because you don't have to rely on a screen in bright sunlight. You can use an EVF. And for those of you that need reading glasses, well, it's not even about bright light. It's just about being able to not have to shoot blind. Let's be real. So not an option here, and that may be a game breaker for many of you out of the gate. Also, this display cannot do a full 180-degree rotation like the Samsung. So if you're interested in being able to shoot selfies, video blog, whatever it may be, although this isn't ideal with its 15-minute cap on recordings, it's still a great thing to have that the Sony is missing, in the same way that the Sony has a great viewfinder and there's absolutely no viewfinder option for the NX500. So still quality, very close. Some would argue that, again, more keepers are coming out of the Sammy because it has a better autofocus system. I personally have not seen that, but I wouldn't doubt it. I have shot quite a bit with it, but maybe not as extensively as people that have been vested in the Samsung glass lineup. I've only been working also with the kit lens, and there is a pretty large lineup of glass, although it doesn't quite approach what Sony's done with the E-mount over the years since inception, especially when you take into account full-frame glass that can be used on this lens, or rather body, even though it will take into account a crop factor, which actually is a benefit to many people, considering they'd like the extra length, focal length that will be offered by that crop factor applying to full-frame lenses. But again, when it comes to the body and what's built in here, you also have a flash. No flash here. You have to actually attach a flash on the hot shoe, which is something Sony used to do, still incorporates into used to incorporate into less expensive models. And Sony realized a flash should be on board if you're trying to sell a camera that is in a higher tier than something that is just a basic point and shoot. After all, the cell phone, the smartphone market has, for the most part, cannibalized much of that business. So Sony making sure to really give you everything you need. And then something that I won't consider nitpicking, there is a video button here to instantly start capturing video. The Sony also has that right here in a very similar location, but the Sony does have a video mode, so you can actually, right here, switch to this right here, and you can preview and see what you're shooting, have access to settings. On the Sammy, unfortunately, there is no dedicated video mode, so that means you're going to just have to hit record and then see how things will be framed. And since there's cropping going on here because of the 4K and not having a full sensor readout, that means you're not going to have a good preview of what you're shooting. You're going to be, to some extent, starting your recording blind. Now, there is a way to get around that, but for the average consumer, they're not going to do that research. So that is another thing that really Samsung should have been aware of. It's that obvious. So despite them being able to pull together so much tech, so much know-how, and reflect on what errors have been made by companies like Sony, that's still a pretty big miss for a flagship camera like this, which is a great value when you compare that it has the same sensor as the much more expensive NX1 sibling, but is missing much of the prosumer features like the extended 4K video capture, clean HDMI output, as well as the cropping of the 4K sensor, no direct readout. There is no weather sealing on either of these bodies. Sony does incorporate a viewfinder that you don't get here. In terms of the side panel, Sony's multi-port, which is micro USB essentially, and HDMI out. So you have those two things going for it. That's also how you're going to charge the camera. Battery life a little bit better with the Samsung, at least in my experience, but very close. Same array of ports here, micro USB and HDMI out. Key difference being that Sony does make some accessories for their micro HDMI, so it's not just for charging like it is with the Samsung. Down here is your battery bay as well as SD card slot. It's very similar design again to what Sony has to offer with the A6000. You can see basically the exact same orientation here for your battery and SD card. Both have NFC and Wi-Fi. I mentioned that before, but the Wi-Fi experience a little bit more rich with Sony. They've been doing it longer. Control of the camera, and then all of those different applications in the App Store, some of which are free, some are pay. Your NFC contact point right here on the grip. I do find that the grip is far better to hold, more ergonomic, and better if you're dealing with larger lenses than the I would say, lip compared to the grip on the A6000 that the NX500 has to offer. And there are far less buttons on here, less dials, less customization. It does speak more to the general consumer, I think, than the enthusiast that the A6000 is trying to appeal to. And that, I believe, is from Sony's experience, something that Samsung is still building on. So I'm not taking anything away from Samsung. It's just obvious in the design that they figured if they threw more specifications, more bells and whistles at the consumer, they might be able to net more sales than the nuance and detail that Sony is putting into their cameras, and foregoing a lot of that, bleeding edge tech like the 4K, not just in UHD, but in cinema, true 4K, which is not something offered at anything in this price range. Again, cropped as opposed to the NX1, but still the same sensor. Same, raw still imaging capability when paired with glass, not as fast as the NX1, but still really compelling. So it's a compromise that not everyone's going to want to make, but I think there is a market for it. I think there are a lot of consumers that will be happy with the NX500, and that's why this comparison is relevant. They're also very close in price. There's no question in terms of features, the NX500 is the king of the hill, but it's compromised like the H.265, which seems like a great idea for having the most efficient codec for 4K video out there. After all, what needs it? 4K video. It does backfire in having to convert. I mentioned earlier, no issues like that here, but no 4K video. So if you must have 4K video, then obviously the NX500 or the NX1 is going to be the better option. But I do find most people still don't require it, even though I always recommend it, because future-proofing video is key. You may not need it today, but you'll thank yourself, or me in this case, down the road when you do have video captured in 4K and you actually eventually do have that display to watch it, enjoy it, and say, wow, I'm glad I didn't end up getting this in 1080p because it looks like garbage compared to 4K, especially the cinema 4K that this camera has to offer. Now, my experience has been limited to the 16 to 50 mil kit lens. I'm sure with if I had a broad range of lenses to test this with, I would have probably even better things to say about it. But at the end of the day, as I've already said, when it comes to just simply still camera performance, I am still partial to the A6000. It's more of a camera at the end of the day in the most basic sense, between having a flash, a viewfinder, a real grip, more customizable buttons. I mean, when you look at the back of each of these cameras, you can just see that the button layout is very similar in terms of your mode dial, your menu button, but there are just more customizable buttons available with Sony. So it's not just the EVF as well as the grip. It is more customization, more thought about traditional photography. So again, the NX500, all about bringing together all of the best tech in the electronic world with some corners cut that Samsung believed most consumers will not care about, especially they get a touchscreen that so many wish was available here, and great battery life to boot, and best-in-class video quality with the conversion. But the A6000, cut and dry, still one of the best cameras on the market. I've done videos about this time and time again, especially with the price going down. You really cannot beat it if what you're after is just a great digital imaging device and video is secondary. Video on here is still great, but not 4K. And at this point, at least for me, 4K is becoming something that I absolutely must have on a body like this. And I'm hoping Sony will shortly announce the A7000, whatever it may be, that will hopefully incorporate 4K or UHD video capture, at least, since Sony isn't offering anything at the consumer level yet with Cinema 4K, but they will include UHD capability, and that would probably be the body that should be compared to this. But since these are both out at the same time, both attracting the same consumer because of price point, form factor, lens costs, I had to share this comparison with all of you. So right now, for me personally, the A6000 is still the go-to because for less money, I feel you are getting a better overall camera than the NX500, despite the fact that the NX500 on paper is quite frankly unbeatable. The problem is great things on paper don't always translate into great products in the real world, especially when you already have certain expectations or needs. Someone who needs an EVF simply can't consider this. Even though you can mount a flash here, that's the beginning and the end. So a lot to like here. Wi-Fi and NFC work straightforward. You do have to download an app, much like you do with Sony, but you don't get the benefit of that whole library, which some would write off as just a marketing specification. But I think it really has grown into part of the identity, much like the build and all of the attention to detail and trying to accommodate the feedback that Sony's gotten from users. That's just something Samsung doesn't have to work with yet. They're getting there, and the NX500 definitely the best foot forward, most impressive camera in my opinion, even in some ways more impressive than the NX1, because even though the NX1 is really the pro version of this with all of the corners not being cut, its price point is still too high in my opinion, maybe for some not compared to the GH4, but too high for me personally when I think that Sony's got a full-frame 4K option with internal 4K, I should point out, eventually coming to us, and at a price I'd much rather pay for something in the full-frame world, even though, of course, you give up the form factor and the lens size of APS mirrorless, which is what we're seeing at its finest right here. Of course, the A6000 update will likely have 4K, and that, again, would be the best camera to compare this to, but at the time of this review, these are the two kings of the hill in terms of mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras in the same form factor, same price range, and in my opinion, again, the A6000 is the better camera if you're not looking for the best of both worlds quite literally and can live without the compromises that the NX500 most certainly pushes on you, which I've reiterated over and over again, the crop video, the missing EVF, and on top of that, a flash that is something else you have to bring with you. It's not built in, less buttons, but when it comes to still in video quality, amazing. And of course, you will have to convert all of that video. So more work, but if the juice may be worth the squeeze to you, and you may already own a lot of Sammy glass. Most people, though, do not, and that's why the Sony more and more will look like the far more attractive and more value-oriented choice, especially since, again, most consumers aren't like me, and they aren't after 4K, even if, again, I believe they should be for future-proofing their memories, because that's what, after all, devices like this are all about, beyond just being creative and trying to capture the moment in general. So that pretty much rounds out at least my personal experience with the great NX500 offering from Sammy and the already bona fide king of the hill in the APS-C realm, the A6000 from Sony. So both are great choices. I don't think you'll go wrong with either of them as long as you actually watch this whole video and understand the compromises that each of these makes. But at the end of the day, both are really aimed at the same consumer, but in many ways different consumers, if that makes any sense, considering Sony seems to be a little bit more astute to what people are in the market for, whereas Samsung is just trying to use all of their technological prowess to woo you, and that will work for some, no question about it. But for others, they're going to want to still, much like those who stay loyal to Canon and Nikon without even any reason at this point, Sony will appeal, I think, more to those that want a traditional photographic experience that's much more, I don't want to say professional, but much more black and white, much more pro style than what Sammy has put together, in something that I could see a mom shooting with just as easily as a prosumer, whereas the A6000, I'm not saying that couldn't be the case. It absolutely could be. The soccer mom with that autofocus, the A6000 is a great camera to have, but I just see it falling into the hands of someone who's going to use more of the features, be more manual oriented than who the NX500 is trying to appeal to, which is really a consumer that's going to stay in auto just about 99% of the time. And it'll do a great job, as will the A6000, but the A6000 has room for more growth than the NX500, clearly. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.